This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Does anyone have any questions before you can get started? Anyone, any questions? Online, offline, anyone, any questions, guys? No. Admin part, you will still have 1 month. It's still 1 month of admin. So after that, that's when you'll go into DevOps. So you still, scripting is still a part of administrator. Like I wouldn't say scripting is completely a part of DevOps because as administrators, we also use scripting. So administrators also do a lot of scripting out there, and also DevOps shares that scripting knowledge. So there is a lot of overlap between a DevOps and the administrator part of role out here. So admin is not yet completed. I will still have to, let's say, cover a good amount of services in the administration and then move into DevOps as such. As discussed, archive blobs can't be read or written. Why does Microsoft still charge for the operation? You're storing it. It's not charge for the operation. You're storing it out, and when you read it, that's where your operation cost will actually come into picture. That's where your transaction cost actually comes into picture. Meaning, when you want to read it, you have to, let's say, shift it towards, let's say, something like cool or hot to rehydrate it. So once you rehydrate it, that's when the transaction cost actually comes into picture. Yes. Any more questions, guys? Anyone? Any more questions before I can get started? All right. So let's come back here and let's focus again, guys. Guys online, I'll put you all on mute. If you have any questions in between of the session, please type it in the chat box. I'll take it once we have the Q&A session up there. All right. So let's come back here. Let's get started. And this is what I want to start with. So this is what we were telling yesterday, right? That if you let's say if you are given an opportunity to create one storage account, not a big deal. I can just go ahead and create one particular storage account using the Azure portal. I'm okay with that. So one storage account, it's not a huge let's say issue to create directly using the Azure, let's say, portal. But the issue comes in when you get the actual requirements. And when I'm talking about actual requirement out here, a client comes sometimes can come up and say, you know what, hey, you know what, I need like around 10 storage accounts, and under each and every storage account created about 100 containers. Under each and every container, I need 1,000 blobs to be uploaded. I also need lifecycle to be uploaded, and please give it to me in an hour. Something like this. Now it'll become humanly impossible to go ahead and do all these things, or humanly, let's say, not possible to go ahead and, let's say, create all these things, provision all these things using the Azure portal. Using the Azure portal, it's very difficult for me to go ahead and manually achieve all these things. Reason why? Azure exposes itself towards automation, meaning Azure allows automation, and automation in different forms. So when you're working with the Azure portal, especially when you're working right now with the Azure portal, you are working in a portal called, or you're working in a model called ARM model, Azure Resource Manager model out here. Earlier, when Azure started in, let's say, 2010, we had something called as a classic model. That was the first model that Azure used to offer. That's the reason you still see an option to go ahead and create a classic storage account called as legacy storage account out there. Now, a lot of companies, a lot of clients who are using or making use of the cloud are coming through the ARM model as such. Guys, can you hear my voice in the back? Not here. Okay. I forgot to put this one. So just give me a second. I'll continue with the session. Okay, good now. Are we good now? Let's try this out once again. Is it okay now? Good now. Great. So that's what I was coming down to, and I was telling that the model that Azure had earlier was called as a classic model of, let's say, the portal, which was version 1. Now we are dealing with something called Azure version 2, And Azure version 2 is also called as the ARM model, Azure Resource Manager model out here. Now, in the Azure Resource Manager model as such, Azure exposes itself to a lot of automation options that you can get. Meaning, you can create resources on Azure, which are resource groups, storage accounts, and all the resources on Azure using some kind of a programmatic approach. Like you can use a .NET program, Python, Java, scripting, I mean, Python, Java programming languages, and etc. Whatever programming that you can think of, .NET, C Sharp, Python, and etc. You can use those and also, let's say, create resources in Azure, interact with the Azure portal, or you can also do some kind of a scripting out here using PowerShell, CMD, or Bash. PowerShell, CMD are something which is native to Windows operating system, or let's say relatable to the Windows operating system out there. But Bash comes into picture when you are working with a Linux environment. Into a Linux environment, Bash something comes into picture. There is something called as a declarative syntax. You can use something called as ARM templates, which is one of the most popular model when you work with Azure, or something called as terraforms, or now you have a latest option called Azure Bicep. So either ARM template, terraforms, or Azure Bicep is something that you can use to interact with the Azure cloud, to create resources, to create resource groups, to create, let's say, multiple resources on the Azure portal. And finally, you have something called as a REST API method, wherein there is another method called REST API using which you can also create this out. And in our sessions, we are going to cover not this one. We are not doing a programmatic approach, because if I want to go into a programmatic approach, I'll have to, let's say, teach you the basics of a particular programming language like .NET, Python, and etc. No, this is not what we are doing. But we will be doing this one, the scripting approach using PowerShell or Bash at a later point in time. CMD, how do you go ahead and, let's say, interact with the Azure portal, etc. And we will be looking at the declarative syntaxing as well. We'll be primarily looking at ARM templates and terraforms. I'll also try to cover Azure Bicep if the time permits. But the primary, let's say, goal is to cover ARM and terraforms in a very good detail. And we'll also be looking at the REST API method in the coming classes as such. So we are going to look at 3 out of the 4 available, let's say, programming approaches. One I'm not covering at all because it's completely into programming. The rest three I'll be touching up, let's say, with this one. But today's class is all about PowerShell. We are going into this particular scripting and we are looking at something called as PowerShell out here. So again, does anyone in this particular class, or did anyone in this, let's say, let's do a couple of questions. Yes. Recording is started. Recording has started out here. So that's the first thing that I did. I started recording in this, and then got started with the class out here. So yes, okay. Voice is still coming, right? Cool, great. So we'll start with PowerShell today. That is what our goal is. And we want to understand, or what do we want to do is that we want to understand PowerShell at a very, very basic level, the very basics of PowerShell. And let's go into a couple of intermediate concepts out there with PowerShell. I wouldn't say I'll be covering all PowerShell. No, it is impossible to cover entire programming language end to end. It's all about practice. So we'll do a lot of assignments in PowerShell. We'll firstly see what are the basics. We'll do some good amount of basics out here, and then we'll go into, let's say, the language called PowerShell out here. So we'll start with the very basics. We'll go into some intermediate. We'll write some scripting programs out here using PowerShell. We'll do some basics out there, and then we'll try to apply our knowledge into Azure. That is what is the end goal that, let's say, I am, let's say, aiming towards. So again, you couple of people might be familiar with scripting. Couple of people might not be familiar with scripting. Again, if you even know C, that basics can be applied to this PowerShell. If you even don't know that, I'm good with it. Not a problem. Now, in order to get started with PowerShell, you need a software called PowerShell ISE installed. There is something called PowerShell ISE that comes pre-installed with any operating system which is greater than or equal to Windows 7 Service Pack 1. There's an operating system called Windows 7 Service Pack 1. That's a flavor of Windows 7 operating system. So if you're using Windows 7 Service Pack 1 or Service Pack 2, or if you're using Windows 8, 8.1 or Windows 10 or in Windows 11, PowerShell ISE comes installed predefined. You don't have to, let's say, install it out. If you want to check it out, just go to your start menu and just type in PowerShell ISE, and this is what you have: PowerShell ISE, and then you have something called PowerShell ISE in brackets x86. This is a 64-bit operating system. This is a 32-bit operating system. So it depends upon which operating system you are using. Is it a 64-bit architecture or is it 32-bit architecture? Now, most of the systems that you use are 64 bits. Most of the home operating systems that you use are 64 bits. So it's safe to say that you can go ahead, click on this one called PowerShell ISE out here, and this is how it will open. And when you open PowerShell, you will just get this blank screen. You'll just get this particular blank screen whenever you open PowerShell out here. This is called as the input console. So you can go ahead, write something. You can do some, it's like a notepad. You can write something and you can store something out here in your input, and then you have something called as an output. How do you look at input and the output out here? If you look at my screen, there are three buttons out here. This is a full screen out here. I can split my screen, and if you look at a blue screen out here, this is the output console and this is the input console. You can split it vertically or you can split it horizontally, anything your choice. You can split this out using these buttons out here called vertical and horizontal split out here. And this is where you can write something, and after you write, this is where the output will be displayed. Whatever you write, the output will be displayed in the bottom. This is what you can do using that particular PowerShell out here. So let's do that. Let's start with the very basic of it, and let's say I want to write something like hello world, because usually whichever programming you start will start with hello world. So let's not break the tradition. Let's start with the tradition called hello world out here. And if I want to write something in PowerShell, the command that I need to use is called as a write hyphen host, meaning write something to the output, called write hyphen host. So I'm telling write host. It's like if you are from a C background, it's like printf, and go ahead and print something out there onto the output console. It says write host, and after that give a space, and whatever you want to write, give it inside a quotation, open and close. I'll say hello world. And if I want to execute what I've written, there are two buttons out here: execute everything, meaning execute all the lines, or execute one specific line where your cursor is there. I'll just click on this one. It's either called F8, or you can click on this particular button out here. And as and when I execute it, it's telling this is the input, and now it's giving me the what? Output out here called hello world. So it's giving me some kind of an output here telling hello world in written, and telling me that okay fine, this is your output console. Again, if I want to change the color of the output, if I, let's say, want to go ahead and change the color of the output, this is a plain white color. If I want to change this, the condition here is that firstly give your write host statement, say write host whatever you want to write. After this, you are giving a quotes, you are giving anything in the quote like hello world and all that stuff. Give a space and say hyphen. If you do hyphen, it will tell you what all you can actually write here. Is it a separator, line separator? Is it no new line? There's something called foreground color. I'll say take this called foreground color. All these things that you pass here are called arguments to a particular command. There are two things that actually come in PowerShell. One is the command, the other is the argument. The command here is write host. This is the command that I'm actually working with called write host. and I'm passing an additional argument to this particular command called a foreground color. I'm saying hyphen foreground color. I'll say space, and after, as I do a space, it will give me all the colors that I can actually select. And let's say yellow, something like this, that can be noticeable in a dark screen. And if I execute this out, this is how my output will now look like. So I'm saying right host hello world, giving a space, telling foreground color out here, and giving a color out here, and this is the output, how it gets displayed in an yellow color. If I don't execute this, if I don't execute this line, if I can, I'll just highlight all these things out. I'll say run selection. This is what I'll get in without a color out here. But if I want to execute all these things, I'll just select everything and I'll say execute this out. So this is how the output actually kind of changes out here. This is how the output really changes as such. Yes, any questions still here? I'll go absolutely slow in PowerShell because you can get a lot of questions, and you can, let's say, get a lot of, let's say, questions in the basics out there. So yes, any questions out here, online or offline, until here on Linux is an operating system, yes. Now I said Linux is an operating system, on top of which I said something called Bash. Bash is a scripting that you can perform on top of an operating system called Linux. That's what I said. Linux is the operating system, yes. I wouldn't even say Linux is an operating system. Linux is a kernel on top of which you can install multiple operating systems as such. Bash is a language with which you can interact with Linux. Like PowerShell is a language that you can interact with Windows. This one, PowerShell ISE, only for Windows. Linux is different. Linux is, I mean, Bash is different. Bash, the correct. The difference between PowerShell ISE, good question. PowerShell ISE is called Integrated Service Environment. Guys, can you please go on mute again? Ravi, can you please go on mute? I'll just come back to you if you have a question. Difference between PowerShell and PowerShell ISE is that PowerShell ISE here, PowerShell ISE here is called as an integrated service environment, which will help you write something, do something input, do give you something in the output and etc. But you also have something called PowerShell, just Windows PowerShell out here. Something called Windows PowerShell, which is just like your command prompt, but with a different color. That's it. It's just a command prompt wherein you can write commands. You cannot store them. You cannot have an input and output. It's completely output. It's completely output out here. So if I say write host, say hello world, it's input. I mean, the input here, I'll have to pass it here in the output only. I cannot store it. I cannot save it. I just can execute this out. This is just like a CMD, command prompt. So if you say CMD out here, command prompt, same like CMD, but the color is just changed. That's it. Same like CMD. Both are products of Microsoft only. Both come with installed with the operating system. But if you are beginning with PowerShell, ISE is better for you because you can write, execute something like this, etc. An upgraded or an extension to CMDS. You can consider it this to be an upgraded version of CMDS. Yes, any questions, guys? Is it available for in MacBook Pro? In MacBook Pro, no, it's not available. You can, however, use something called as if you are using a different environment, you can use something called PowerShell Core. There's something called PowerShell Core. You can install PowerShell Core on Windows, Linux, or Macintosh. You can go with this one and install this out, and you will still get the same thing. Or if you want to, let's say, have a better environment with input and output, and if you are using Mac OS, use something called Visual Studio Code. You can install this for Linux, Mac, and all these things, and you can write your PowerShell commands out here. We'll also discuss about that, but you can use this particular website to install VS Code as well. Basically, Linux CMD ISC write while coming to the commands. Basically, Linux CMD ISC are same while writing when coming to the commands. Kind of language is a little different. Bash follows a different syntax. PowerShell follows a different syntax, and ISC and PowerShell almost are the same. They follow the same syntax, but Bash and PowerShell they follow a different syntax altogether. Like if I write host and say hello world, it will work in PowerShell. But if I use the same thing in Bash, it won't work. I'll have to use a different language altogether, or I'll have to use a different syntax altogether in Bash. Yes, any more questions, guys? How to connect with server? Which server are you talking about? Correct. Where do you want to connect to? That's the first question. So if I say connect to a server, what do you want to connect to using PowerShell? Do you want to connect to Azure? Do you want to connect to something else? That is something which will come back later. That's the reason I was saying first let's cover PowerShell basics, and then let's apply that particular basics to Azure. When we are applying to Azure, then we'll see how to connect to Azure and everything. But if you are interested, the command is called connect-az account. You'll have to pass your credentials and you'll have to connect to it. Yes, any more questions, guys?
Hi Kiran.
Good, please.
Hi Kiran.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead. I can hear you.
If you got a PowerShell, then also you have to learn CMD and Dutch for
See,
development.
again, DOS is a different thing altogether. DOS is completely different. But if you learn PowerShell, that's good enough for now.
Thank you, Kiran.
Yes, don't we need to have knowledge in programming? Is it needed? Not really. You don't really need to have a programming knowledge. As discussed about all classes till now comes under Azure Admin. Azure Admin, you will have to deal with Azure administration till the next 30 days, meaning 1 month more. You'll have to, let's say, deal with Azure administration. ISC integrated service environment. PowerShell is case sensitive programming language. Yes, PowerShell is case sensitive programming language. Yes, any more questions here? And if you want to clear this output, because I have done a lot of things out here, if you want to clear this, just say clear or short form CLS, clear screen. This is CLS and this all will be erased out here. Now let's put people on mute and let's get started with this one. All right. Now let's do this. I will now want to go ahead and write my name and give a couple of details about me, telling that my hobbies, where I belong to, and all that stuff. So what I'll do is I'll say write host, and I'll say my name is Kiran. And again, I'll say give a write host statement here and say I belong to Hyderabad. I'll again say write host, or I'll say Kiran belongs to Hyderabad. And I'll say write host. Kiran likes watching movies. And multiple things about Kiran, etc. And if I want to execute all of these at a go, I can select everything and I can do a select execution, or I can execute the selection, run selection out here, which will give me something like this. My name is Kiran. Kiran belongs to Hyderabad. Kiran likes movies and all that stuff. And I can keep adding multiple lines. And what I want to prove here, or what I want to highlight here, is this. I can keep adding multiple lines here with the keyword called Kiran, which is repeating itself in each and every line. I just have 3 lines out here with the name called Kiran, and Kiran. Let's say I have 300 lines. I have 300 lines like this with a word called Kiran being repeated again and again. it can be possible, right? Because you are writing a program, that program can be like multiple lines out here. You might be using this particular name called Kiran in multiple lines out here. Now what happens is that all of a sudden, your requirement changes. The name is now not Kiran. The name is, let's say, something like Suresh, or some XYZ, some random name out here. Now what you have to do is that you have to come into each and every line and change that particular name called Kiran to Suresh. Each and every line you'll have to go there and say, you'll have to say Kiran to Suresh, and let's say, Kiran to Suresh and all that stuff. You'll have to change here. So I have to do a Kiran to Suresh, not in one line, but in all the 300 lines, which adds a lot of human effort into my code. Which adds a lot of human effort into my code. So prove is that instead of passing something which changes, this is not static. This is dynamic. It keeps changing. Instead of hard coding it, this is called hard coding, meaning you just go ahead and write your name like this called Kiran. Instead of hard coding it, can I declare it? Can I declare it somewhere? And how do I declare it? That is where something called parameters comes into picture in PowerShell. Parameters in PowerShell are used to declare everything which is dynamic in nature, or anything which is dynamic in nature. What you can do is simple. Let's not treat it as parameters. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone would have done their schooling. There you would have done something called algebra, right? Algebra and all that stuff. Now, when in school we used to do something like x is equal to 5, y is equal to 10, x plus y is 15. So instead of telling 5 plus 10, I am saying x plus y. That x can change, that y can change. In the same way, if I want to declare something in PowerShell, I use something called parameters. And how do I declare a parameter? Is by declaring something called dollar. As in when I declare a dollar, it means that I'm declaring a parameter out here in PowerShell, and I can say a dollar name. This can be anything, dollar XYZ, dollar ABC, whatever it is. And I'll say equal to, I'll say, Kiran, it's a key value pair. The key is dollar name. The value is Kiran out here. And if I execute this, so I'm selecting this line and I'm executing this out. So now PowerShell knows that dollar name is equal to Kiran. This is a declared variable, user declared variable, or user declared parameter called dollar name with an assigned value called Kiran out here. And what I can do here is that in the output console, if I come here, I say write dollar name and say enter. You see what is the value that I'm getting here? Dollar name is just not dollar name. Dollar name holds a value called Kiran out here. This is